Hello, and welcome back to AASA, the School Superintendent Association's Public Education Policy Podcast, or PEP Talk for short. I am Kat Sturdevant. I am the Advocacy and Governance Coordinator and your producer at the top of each episode. Now, on this episode, I decided to put my interviewer hat on to talk to my colleague, Tara Thomas, AASA's policy analyst in our advocacy department, about the Rural Education Achievement Program, or REAP for short. We discussed some fascinating findings from superintendents like you who contributed to our recently released REAP survey report, which inspired this episode. So without further ado, let's get into it. And we are back with AASA's PEP Talk podcast. I'm Kat Sturdevant. I am AASA's Advocacy and Governance Coordinator. Today I'm in the driver's seat. Usually Noelle takes over these questions, so I am excited to do this interview with my colleague, our policy analyst, Tara Thomas, who covers higher ed, early ed, nutrition, appropriations, and important for us today is rural education. So with that, I will welcome aboard Tara Thomas.
Thank you, Kat. I'm excited to be here.
So for a primer on rural education, give us the basics on what we mean when we talk about rural districts.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about rural, there's a huge spectrum of kind of what we're talking about. I think a lot of the times, mainly we'll say if you consider yourself rural, then you are. But there's numerous definitions at the federal level. Obviously, that's my perspective since I work with the federal government. But, you know, the federal definition of rural can differ by program, agency, department. Alone, the Department of Agriculture, USDA, I believe has 11. And so it kind of depends. But overall, there's kind of two key aspects that kind of define rural. One is, low population density, so a small population. And then additionally, geographic distance from more populated areas. And so when we're talking about rural schools, as we both know, across the country, all schools are different, all communities are different, so they look different. But these definitive factors, low population density and geographic distance, kind of create very similar challenges. And so when we're talking about the challenges of rural schools, we're talking about the fact that with a smaller population, that means that rural schools have less students, staff, and then therefore resources than their urban and suburban counterparts. And then, due to their isolated location, services are more expensive to access and more difficult to access. Attracting teachers is far more challenging. Try to get a 23-year-old not from the community to move out there and teach kids can be very difficult. And then, the lack of broadband connectivity obviously is far more prevalent. And so those are, when we're talking about the unique challenges of a rural school, those are really kind of the main challenges that we can kind of say that all rural schools face to some extent. Obviously, like I said, you can't paint any schools or any group of schools with a broad brush, but those are kind of the unique challenges that we refer to when we're talking about rural schools.
And there's a lot of states that you wouldn't think of as being rural that exist. So what are some examples of what would be a rural area?
I think there's a lot of assumptions about what rural places look like and where they are. Obviously, you think of frontier Montana, Alaska, where I grew up, Alabama, we definitely have rural pockets, but there's rural schools in every state. There's not a state that doesn't have them. Obviously, some states there's more concentrations, but a fun fact that I always like to share that I've learned from a colleague is that Long Island has rural schools. And so I think that's, a fact that shocks people, but it really is the perfect example of there are rural schools everywhere.
Part of our work in AASA is that we are working on what we are talking about mostly today, which is the REAP program. So give us the basics on what REAP is.
REAP, because the federal government loves an acronym, REAP is the Rural Education Achievement Program. That is a program that was created by Congress in 2001 in recognition of those unique challenges that I just discussed, right? So it was created specifically for rural schools. It's also known as Title V of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. I know a lot of superintendents refer to it as Title V, not as REAP. Basically, the program is the only program that gives federal money to rural schools specifically because they're rural, right? So the program overall is kind of provided because often, like we discussed earlier, less resources, less capacity. If you have a smaller staff, you're likely not going to have someone on that staff that's capable of managing a competitive grant program. And so that's often what federal funding comes through to districts. And so this program was kind of in recognition that rural districts are going to have a harder time accessing competitive grant programs. And sometimes they're even going to have challenge managing different formula grant programs. And so this was created to replace that and provide a different kind of stream of federal funding to rural schools. So within the program, it's broken into two different ones. So first we have the Small Rural Schools Achievement Program, SRSA. I like to refer to it as SRSA. Most people do not like that. It's exactly what it says. It targets funds specifically to small schools. So it's schools with an average daily attendance of less than 600 and a really narrow definition of rural. That's locale codes 41, 42, 43. Locale codes is how the Department of Education kind of defines rurality, town, suburban, urban. Those are kind of the big buckets that the department places you into and gives you a number associated with that. And so SRSA, SRSA grants, are made directly to districts by the Department of Education. So that's one half of REAP. The other half is the Rural Low Income Schools Program, or RLIS, RELIS. Anytime I can make an acronym into a word, I'm going to do it. But these titles are really straightforward. The Rural Low Income Schools Program does that, right? It targets money towards rural schools that have higher concentrations of low income students. And so the threshold here is at least 20% of students are below the federal poverty line. And this program uses a bit of a broader definition because it includes, on top of 41, 42, 43, like SRSA, it also includes 32 and 33. And then this program is also a little bit more different than SRSA, SRSA, because these funds are first provided to the states, and then states allocate the funding based on either formula or competitive grants. So this is more of kind of the traditional way that we see federal funding getting dispersed to districts, where it first goes to the state and then the state kind of allocates it to the district. But districts can use this funding depending on what program. Both programs have very similar allowable uses. There's some differences, but overall, and then they have a really broad list of what they can use it for, and it's really flexible in terms of how they utilize the funds to support students. But that's kind of in a nutshell what the program is and who can participate.
You mentioned flexibility. What are some of the things that they can use REAP funds for?
It's very flexible. There's a long list of allowable uses. If we want to get really technical, these programs, they're able to use the funding for activities that are allowed under other title programs within ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. I'm not going to bore you by listing the titles because I think only probably superintendents and other program coordinators would know what I'm talking about. So in terms of what it actually means is it can be used for early childhood, career technical education, expanding curricular offerings like providing STEM courses, arts education, professional development for teachers and staff, purchasing technology and devices. It's really a broad range. Supports for English learner students, supports for students with disabilities, resources for libraries. There's a long list of what districts are able to use these funds for in terms of like what best way can they support their students. And I think that's really one of the values of the program is the flexibility, because like I think I've already mentioned 3 times in this interview, all schools are different, all communities are different, and so how they need to spend these funds are going to differ, and providing that flexibility to allow, the leadership and the school board and whoever else to decide how this money should be spent is, I think, really valuable.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think, superintendents know the needs of their districts the best, so to have that flexibility is very good for the district. Speaking of districts, how many districts participate in this program, and are they able to participate in both of those acronym buckets?
Districts can be eligible for both programs, and if that happens, basically what happens is the Department of Education comes out with a master eligibility spreadsheet, and it shows kind of the estimate of how much money a district's going to get from each program. And it can change a little bit. But what I think I know is that what districts often will do is look at the two programs, see whichever bucket of money is bigger, and that's the program that they'll participate in that year. But they're able to switch back and forth. But they can only participate in one program each year.
Interesting.
And so last year, based on data that I got from the Department of Education, 6,217 districts participated in REAP overall.
That's awesome. That is very big. Let's talk about the AASA report that we're putting out. By the time this episode is released, the report will have come out, which is why we wanted to do this episode, to make sure that, if someone didn't have the time to read the report, which we hope you do, they could listen to this podcast. Why did AASA take on this project to ask about REAP as a program?
Almost a third of all schools are rural. 9.8 million students in the United States attend a rural school. And so that's a lot of students. And that number of schools, that's reflected in our membership as well. And so rural education is a priority in the same way that equitable education opportunities are a priority. And as you know, Kat, the AASA advocacy team, we support federal policy that flexibly responds to the needs of rural schools specifically. And we see that really clearly in the REAP program. So it's flexible and it's aimed directly at rural K-12 schools. And so something we realized, though, is that the program itself, an understanding of what this money looks like at the district level and at the school level, had not really been studied in almost a decade. Our main focus for the report was really, how is this money being used at the district level? What does it mean in terms of real supports for teachers and students? And then additionally, we also wanted to really understand, we know how much money is being spent in total, right? The aggregate number, but what does that also look like at the district level? What is the average amount of money that that districts are receiving from this program? Additionally, kind of the last piece of the puzzle is that for fiscal year 23, Congress provided an unprecedented amount of funding for REAP. They provided $215 million, which is about a $20 million increase. So we also really wanted to see, what does that specifically look like at a district level? And so asking that question of, how much of an increase did you see? In a way of kind of getting an understanding, like $20 million is a big number, but once it's broken down among, 6,000 districts, what does that look like? And so that's really what we decided to take on this project, because REAP is so important, but we really need to understand the value of it at the district level.
You mentioned that it had increased that pot of money. Were there any changes to how districts have to conduct themselves or apply for these programs with that increase?
No, there were not any additional strings attached, which we love. This was really just, I think, a recognition from Congress, both sides, and states across the country where, the program is successful and it really supports schools. And so having champions for it and pushing for it, we got that $20 million increase.
That's great. So let's talk about some findings. What did you find? What were some of the most common investments that people are making with their REAP dollars?
Yeah, absolutely. No one can see this because obviously it's an audio medium, but I'm smiling and I'm just thinking about the TikTok audio the trend where it's like, oh my gosh, I love this question, because it's kind of like what's playing in the back of my mind, because I do love this question. So thank you for asking, Kat. So there were really two kind of big parts of the question of, what investments are made with this funding. So the first question, very straightforward, we provided a list of kind of the categories that the Department of Education provides of how REAP funding can be spent. We provided a list of that, asked them to check all that apply. So that list that I kind of read off earlier of all the different ways that REAP districts can use funding, we provided that in the survey and asked, please select how you're going to use your REAP dollars in fiscal year or for school year 2023. And with that, we were able to kind of get a top 3 most common investments made by REAP districts. Number 1, 56% of respondents selected that they use REAP funding for purchasing technology, devices, and software. That was number one. 56% was definitely, obviously, the largest percentage, but you'll see kind of a huge jump to number two. Number two was professional development for teachers and staff, but that was at 27%.
Oh, wow.
And then number three, there was kind of a tie with 20%, and that was investing in greater staff compensation and then also expanded curricular offerings. So providing STEM classes, arts education, those are the examples that I provide because that was kind of what we put in the parentheses in the survey. But, just kind of expanding access to different curriculum for students. And then all of the other responses, which listeners can go access it and find it in the report, really ranged between kind of 10% and 16%, marking that that's what they used REAP funding for. While I think as a researcher, for me looking at the data, it was kind of disappointing not to see like 70%, 60%, like these big percentages, like the majority are using this funding for these three things. That was disappointing to me. I do think it really does underscore the value of the flexibility of the program. No two districts are alike. No two districts are going to use all of their REAP funding for the exact same things. And so I think that was really something that I took away was, not having these three big takeaways, these three main investments that they're using REAP for, actually just really underscores the value of allowing schools to specifically target the funding that best suits their students.
I do think it's interesting that the top was providing tech for students because we always have talked about bridging the digital divide. So it's very cool to see that they are looking at that and making that initiative. That's very cool. These are very valuable investments, and it's cool that, everybody is so different.
Absolutely. So then that was kind of number one, is kind of the top three big percentages of how money's being used. And then the second part of the question was providing an opportunity for open-ended responses. So we just provided as much space as they wanted and asked them to provide greater, them being superintendents, asking them to provide, additional details and specifically how they're using their REAP funds. That was really where we got to see, one, it was my favorite part of the entire survey because I really got to see the really great things that schools are supporting students and doing with this funding and seeing the importance of it. But it also just provided greater, I think, insight into, a little bit more nuance to these investments. So, for example, under technology, devices, and software, many indicated that they used REAP funds for one-to-one devices, which I think is kind of what we would acknowledge or expect. But then other districts really demonstrated a broader investment in technology that you may not initially think of when you think about that quick category. So, updating a primary server, investing in an intercom system and a door entry technology for school safety, purchasing software that enables teachers and parents to communicate, or software for screening for math and reading proficiency, and even improving data systems to support students with career and college readiness. To me, once I got into those individual cases, like I think updating the primary server is a perfect example, and it's a really necessary reminder that the needs in rural schools are often greater and a little bit more ranging than those of their urban and suburban counterparts. And then another fascinating pattern that I saw when I kind of dove into the more open-ended responses was the use of REAP funds to kind of address school staff shortages.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, I mean, because you mentioned earlier, obviously, one of my issues is higher education, which is addressing the teacher shortage and ensuring that we have, high quality teachers ready for all students. And so this was a really fun kind of overlap for me. But we're talking across the country, you hear the superintendents talk about it all the time, they're really struggling to find teacher candidates. And then once they get candidates, it's hard to get teachers to stay in the field. We know that teachers leave within 5 years of entering the workforce. What I thought was really interesting, and I think we've had these conversations before, where often when you're talking about teacher retention and recruitment, while both are equally necessary, and especially recruitment, I think the data is getting a little bit more worrying because the enrollment numbers of students entering teacher preparation programs is slowly declining. But really, for most schools, when we're talking about these two, retention is kind of the key focus. because most teachers leave within the first 5 years. And so it's a very expensive process to hire. And then if you're constantly replacing, so how do we get teachers to stay? For rural schools, it's the opposite challenge. So it's very hard, kind of like I mentioned earlier, to convince, a 23-year-old who wants to go live in a city and, go out or do things that young 20-year-olds do, to convince them to go to a rural community where maybe there's not a lot of the traditional things that you would want to do as a young person. For rural schools, it's the recruitment piece is a lot harder, and it's actually commonly seen as one of the many strengths of a rural school is their level of retention.
Interesting.
So once a teacher's there, right, a smaller community often means closer relationships. That means with students, with families, with your administrators, with your fellow teachers. It's a more of a tight-knit community. And schools are often kind of in a rural place, they're often the core of the community. And that was something we definitely saw during the pandemic. Rural schools really have to focus on that recruitment piece. And then once they get the recruitment, those teachers are often more likely to stay and stay for a longer period of time because of the relationship that they're able to build in a smaller community. And so what I saw with these open-ended questions or these open-ended responses is like the pattern of using the staff compensation or greater staff compensation and the professional development to fill vacancies, right? So I saw with professional development, many respondents shared that they were using professional development to provide certification to a teacher to enable them to teach a different course. And that's something that happens often in rural schools that I think is often overlooked, that teachers are often teaching many different courses because of the difficulties that rural schools face in recruitment. And then in some of the smallest schools with the really small student populations, teachers must juggle teaching different grades as well. So that's a different challenge. And I think that's always something to highlight. Yeah, imagine having, a third grader, a fourth grader, a sixth grader, and a seventh grader, and you're having to kind of teach them all in different ways. That's something that a lot of rural teachers do experience and that is often overlooked. But we saw kind of that use of professional development to not just, here's the new, here's like a new technology, here's how to learn it, which is obviously equally important. Professional development is very important for many different reasons, but rural schools we saw more using professional development specifically to get certified to teach another class because they probably don't have an existing teacher who can teach that course. And so that was one piece that we saw. And then obviously additionally under the greater staff compensation, many respondents reported a kind of adding a broad array of critical positions through REAP funds. So I got responses saying they were able to hire a counselor, social worker, family support coordinator. These are all different responses that I've obviously put into one. Tutors, reading specialists, instructional technology directors, paraprofessionals, school nurses, just the list went on and on of because they were able to have REAP funds, they were able to offer a competitive salary, and therefore they were able to attract someone and they were able to have enough money to keep this support available for their students. And then additionally, we saw there was other indicators that they were also using greater staff compensation to reduce class sizes, which we know also can have a positive impact on student learning. And so that was something that I found really fascinating that that was kind of one pattern that we saw when it came to how they were using REAP funds, and that we thought was really interesting.
It almost responds to what we're seeing, as we come back from COVID, that, they're moving towards those counselor positions and mental health things to make sure that they're doing the recovery needed for students. So it's interesting that we're seeing that even in REAP funds, which has been a program for so long. To kind of close us out, what are your hopes for this report and who is the main audience?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a few different audiences, but for me as a member of the AASA advocacy team and who works on rural policy, my main audience for this is members of Congress and their staffers, right? So one, I think often it's really helpful for members of Congress and other decision makers to see the real impact of a program when they're making the decision of how much money to appropriate, right? So understanding kind of the real impact that these funds have at the district level is really good information to know. And I think it's often what they want to see. I think, especially if you can make it specific to their district, which unfortunately I can't get that specific, but overall understanding the program. And then two, for staffers, I think understanding the numerous challenges that rural schools can face. I think if you don't come from a rural community, it's really hard to truly understand what they're dealing with. I know I always talk about, I'm from Alabama, so I knew what it was like to drive 30 minutes through farmland to get to a friend's house. And I thought I knew what rural was. And then I started working with actual rural educators and rural advocates, and I was like, oh, I had no idea. And so I really hope that this report can kind of just serve as maybe an entry point into the experience of rural schools and rural districts and rural students, and they can understand the value of the program, obviously, and become an advocate for it. That would be my ideal scenario. But then also kind of become an advocate overall for rural students, and so that's kind of the immediate priority or the immediate audience and kind of my greatest hope. But overall, I think having conversations around other questions that we didn't get into, because, the podcast can only be 30 minutes. You weren't going to give me 4 hours to talk about this, although I could. We also asked, how much money, like I mentioned, how much money they get, and then also what are the challenges with this program? And one thing we found was actually this is a very easy program for them to navigate. And so I think that can also serve as a lesson learned for how to make other federal programs accessible to smaller and rural districts. And I hope that's also a key takeaway for people that read the report. And before we close out, I really would like to just say a sincere thank you to all of the superintendents who took their time to take this survey. I know they've got a lot of things on their plate, a lot on their to-do list, and I just really do appreciate their time and their commitment to this, because none of this information would be available to me. This report would not be possible without you, so thank you.
Where can people find you or reach out to you if they have any questions about the program or rural education?
Yeah, absolutely. So they can find all of my contact information on the AASA advocacy page, but you can find me on Twitter, or X, I guess it's called, at Tara E. Thomas 1. Obviously, my name is very common. It was hard for me to get a unique Twitter handle. And then I think you can just put my email address, honestly, in the description, and hopefully everyone can find me there.
Great. Well, that is going to do it for our episode on REAP. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And that's a wrap on this episode of AASA's PEP Talk podcast. We invite you to share it by using the hashtag PEP Talk on Twitter. You can access past episodes in the PEP Talk library by visiting aasapeptalk.podbean.com. And once again, thank you for joining us.